Okay, so now we move on to the next speaker, and this is André Nehmert. With André Nehmert, he is the founder and managing partner of the Institute for Digital Transformation in Healthcare at the University Witten-Herdecke. And he has more than 15 years as a clinical experience as chief physician for thoracic surgery at maximum care hospitals. And he's coupled this with an engineering background, and he's driven by the fascination of cutting-edge technology. And he's particularly engaged in the opportunities of AI in medicine, seen his background, and his focus really lies on the ethical implications of the digital medical progress. You can imagine that there are so many now in the applications that come. And he's also a board member of the International Data Spaces Association and leader of the health data community. And he's committed to the technology implementation and preservation of individual data sovereignty, which is obviously critical. So we are very much looking forward to your talk. Hopefully you can share your screen now. Yes, we can see it. Very good. So let's test your sound. You should be, yes, you should be, you're on green now.
So.
Yes, we can hear you. Perfect.
Perfect. Dear Dr. Chaton, dear ladies and gentlemen, what an impressive lineup here today. Thank you for having me here, maybe for a little different lecture, actually. Some of you may remember this iconic photo. There's an image that spread at a time when there were no smartphones or social media platforms. On March 24, 1989, the oil tanker of the Exxon Oil Company ran aground off the coast of Alaska, causing one of the greatest environmental catastrophes in shipping. At the same time, however, this was also the famous last drop that brought a barrel to overflow. A critical public has been complaining about the geopolitical and ecological issues for years. And the emerging globalism also arised questions of sustainability that were taken up by international bodies and NGOs and were translated into human rights principles. Well, at the national level, this led to the entry of the Green Party into the German Bundestag. The extra-parliamentary opposition movements were now able to take up the concerns of many people with their pro-ecological movement and bring the need for solutions to the problems into political work. The ecological crisis had now reached the Western industrial nations in particular and has shaped the political discourse ever since. Almost 40 years later now, the Green Party has made its mark in the political establishment and has become the third strongest force in the current federal elections, as may you know. People want concrete measures against the ecological crisis and an active climate policy from the next German government. But progress has also been made on the level of sustainability over the past 40 years. For example, the so-called CSR Directive. It was passed in 2014 by the European Parliament, and it is intended to increase transparency with regard to the ecological and social aspects of companies in the EU, in particular with regard to the four sustainability areas as the environment, social and employees issues, human rights, bribery, and corruption. With the CSR Directive Implementation Act, the directive has also been anchored into national law in Germany since 2017. Capital market-oriented companies with more than 500 employees required by the CSR ROC to provide expanded and non-financial reportings. So the following patterns can be recognized from the experience with the ecological crisis, which is still one of the greatest challenges facing mankind. First, an increasing critical public and extra-parliamentary movements generate attention. Second, an event shakes the public, usually combined with an emotional charge and indignation of a critical mass. Third, the first acute interventions take place, mostly on the basis of voluntary self-commitments and ethics. And fourth, the legitimized organs of regulation, defined rules, and binding laws are introduced. So perhaps one day this photo will have a similar iconic status and also remind us of the beginning of a threatening crisis in human history. Perhaps this most unfortunate chapter of the erosion of democratic institutions will mark the turning point in global digitization. And perhaps this event is also that drop that brings the barrel to overflow. Due to exponentially increasing computing power based on integrated circuits and computer chips, in accordance with Moore's law, tech companies now dominate the ranking of the most valuable corporations. The power of platforms, their potential of surveillance, and their influence are increasingly leading to a social dilemma. The face of the crisis still seems harmless, but the consequences are already immense. The data of millions of people are collected, stored, merged, and in the best case, only sold without their consent. Nevertheless, every possible abuse that is conceivable has already taken place. The consequences of mass surveillance are manifold and cannot be examined in this lecture in a nearly satisfactory manner, but these developments are not without consequences for our political and social coexistence, as well as for the entrepreneurial action and the entire economy. At a political level, the first effective regulatory measures are being taken. Linked to this is what I would say is a renaissance of the ethics. Values determine the discussion and they mark the direction. Since laws cannot be formulated so quickly, parliaments are reliant on initially making companies accountable by means of voluntary commitment. So here the same pattern can be seen that we already experienced during the ecological crisis. First, a critical public, then an acute and emotionally charged event, then initial reactions based on ethical values and principles. And now the question rises, what's next? Well, analogous to the sustainability criteria, companies now have the option to initially face their responsibility voluntarily. CDR initiatives formulate initial standards for how companies can meet their responsibility issues. The attention to the handling of data is increasing. For companies, this means that their credibility and the trust of their consumers is at risk. And every company that has a data-driven business model, and that will literally be every company in the future, has to think about how their data is handled and how do I keep my customers' trust. Well, in the following, I would like to show what the path for companies can look like using an example of a cooperation between the Merck AG and the Institute for Digital Transformation in Healthcare. In the beginning, there is, of course, an unconditional intention of a company to maintain the trust of its customers. On the journey towards a digital company, now ethics take over the orientation as a compass. Both from the business units and from the data analytics and processing units, requirements are placed on the efficient process in which ethics must not become a bottleneck. The goal of using data for innovative purposes requires a manageable ethics. At the beginning, the company must be aware of its own values, of course. Based on existing principles, we will then create our own code of ethics, which is going to be published and has already passed the peer review process. In a decision algorithm, business units direct a question to the so-called digital ethics office, and with the appropriate expertise and tools that are developed, an analysis is carried out as to whether certain principles could be at risk, and a report is sent to the Digital Ethical Advisory Panel. Further strategic and economic consideration are used here, depending on the situation, and then a recommendation is made to the business unit. In order to make this process manageable and efficient, in the sum of all use cases, we also have developed an automated process that gives initial orientation and instructions on the basis of a risk score. Well, in addition to the corporate digital responsibility, we have to consider the social dimension of the digital ethics as well. Every user must be given the opportunity to make sovereign decisions about his or her data. Standards are needed for this. Data spaces, as introduced by the European Commission, could be one of the standards. The regulation will empower users to stay in control of their data and encourage the creation of common European data spaces in all the crucial sectors. The concept of the data spaces respects the heterogeneity of the sources of data explained by 4 characteristics. First, the data space does not require any physical integration of the data. Second, a data room does not provide for a common database scheme. And third, a data room supports networking on the basis of standardized concepts. And fourth, data rooms can be nested with one another and can be overlapping. So in summary, ladies and gentlemen, I state that we are at the beginning of an era in which our entire social and thus also economy life is exposed to the danger of an immense crisis. Algorithmic intelligence, AI, is inexorably finding its way into research and science, but also into consumption and the private sphere. AI is powerful and can get out of control without regulation. But ethics must also provide orientation and can set guardrails and can influence legislation. Ethics must also be embedded in the technology as such, so that in the future we can move not only in a sustainable world, but also safely in what I would call a universe of digitality. And this was my last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Good. Thank you very much, Andre. This was very interesting to see, also to give this the entire spin, sort of like giving this a little bit of the analogy between the CSR and the upcoming CDR and what may come as regulations. And I don't know whether you have realized, but while we were having this conference, actually the Physics Nobel Prize this year was given to the climate researchers. So maybe you want to comment this a little bit to see whether you can see any reference from this decision to your tech talk.
Well, I saw this morning, and I think a physicist, Professor Hasselmann, who actually is very active in the area of sustainability and all these climate crisis, has given the Nobel Prize, and I think that is, that is a very, very strong sign of importance.
Yeah, I mean, it's an encouragement to see maybe that something is coming also in other directions in the future. I mean, I guess the sort of like the future Nobel Prizes will, I think, in some point direction go off the AI for sure. Let's see when it comes in that direction. It's just interesting to see how this is happening live also. And that's the beauty of having a live event. With the tech difficulties also come the really interesting factors like this. I mean, but you were mentioning sort of like the voluntarily of the of digital ethics so far, of data ethics and algorithm ethics. But are there already states anywhere in the world that have been proposed regulations so far?
Yes, yes. Actually, in Denmark, we have this translation into binding laws, and they have already made some laws for this kind of regulation. And it's always the same that in Europe, there are, the first movers who go ahead, and then the rest will follow. And I think the next German the next German Regierung will have to take care of this.
Okay, so obviously this is something that's incoming. I mean, here we have a question actually from Benjamin coming, and I mean, you can see he's really an AI researcher, and he's really, I mean, he really gets the perspective of the ethics, but he really wants to see, okay, you talk a lot about data, how does actually the reference to AI, so what's the AI ethics part in this, or what is the ethics perspective on AI?
Well, actually, if you talk to philosophers, they don't distinguish between digital ethics or any other kind of ethics. Actually, there is ethics, and we were discussing that, Jean, according to the bioethics and medical ethics as well. So maybe we should not focus on digital ethics, but take ethics as a compass, for orientation in a complex world. And the world has always been complex somehow, and ethics has always been some kind of a compass for orientation.
Yes. So in the end, so this is really this. I mean, also sort of like just thinking about sort of like would we address data ethics and let's say algorithm ethics at one, saying, okay, I mean, the one is the basis for the others as well. So this is just, I mean, think about sort of like consent that you need, or also think about Roberto's talk that we had earlier, really about sort of like the EU principles that have been introduced. So really, how can we get this together? Okay, we have another question, and this really goes the direction of where in the digital space would you draw the line between desirable versus enforceable actions, so by companies or individuals?
Well, this all comes down to one question which has not been answered yet, and this is the question of who owns the data. As soon as we have an answer to this question, then we can better decide what is desirable and what is necessary, and how do companies have to be accountable for using the data. So one of the key issues, to my opinion, is who owns the data and who captures the value by using the data.
Okay. Thank you. So you mentioned when you were talking about sort of like now we're in a space where sort of like companies can go forward voluntarily with certain actions. Do you see also risks in this? I mean, when you think about this sort of in the European space and companies are putting forward certain proposals, do you see risks in this?
Well, I see more a risk of not doing it, of not taking responsibility right now. It is more or less voluntarily. The first movers can shape the standards, and so they can make their experiences now without taking too much risk. But there will be a point in the future in which it is not voluntarily anymore, but it is given by law, and I think it is more risky not to take action right now in this dimension and in the area of responsibility than going ahead and giving your own code, giving your own way of dealing with data.
Okay. And sort of coming from your double education, being both an engineer and a medical professional, do you think that especially the medical professional or the healthcare area has a certain, let's say, home advantage in this field when it comes to ethics? I mean, because maybe some of these questions have been around before.
Yeah, well, I think yes, because we doctors, we medical doctors, we have always dealt with ethical questions and ethical issues. So it's kind of our DNA to always think in an ethical category. When we look at the principles, actually, there is a lot of things have in common the digital ethics and the medical ethics, so I think it is an advantage to have to have a background in the medical area. Maybe it is also an advantage to have a background in the engineering area, to understand both languages. But in the healthcare, we are dealing with hypersensitive data, as I would call them, and so there's an urgency and there's a need to act very responsible with this kind of data.
Okay, yes. I mean, we also see this sort of like by the strong kinds of compliance that we have. I mean, that maybe first started in sort of like in the healthcare sector. I mean, we had strong compliance like 10, 15 years ago following certain scandals, but sort of like that drove a certain modernization when it came to standards.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see, do we have any more questions? Yes, so we have one more question, which is sort of ethics versus permissionless innovation. How do we make sure that ethics does not hinder technological progress? And can you do things in the wrong way even with ethics?
Well, it is, I think every one of us has a picture in his mind when we hear ethics. Most of us maybe have, the idea of a old white man with a long beard who is raising his finger and making us accountable for doing something wrong. But this is not the kind of the way I'm looking into ethics. And as I mentioned before, ethics must not be a bottleneck for innovation or business models, but ethics is considered to be more, kind of compass and doing the right things, so if we have these diverse teams, maybe it is very good not to only have software engineers, but also have ethically trained philosophers or medical doctors or any other kind of expertise who brings ethics to the table. Yes.
Okay. And here you have a question that's going a bit farther away. I mean, that's from Ben. He's asking, okay, he's seeing your doctor, so doctor and an engineer. He would be really curious on seeing your idea of sort of like a surgeries in the future and if they might be done digitally and if they might even be done better than by a human. Huh?
This is a very interesting discussion. I don't think that we have the time here, but get in touch with me, because robotics also is a wild field. We can talk about ethics in robotics as well, because surgery and data is a great overlap with robotics, and robotics is advancing, from day to day. And I have quite a lot of experience with robotic surgery. And it is very interesting which is coming up in the future. Yes.
Which also once again brings ethical implications, of course.
Of course.
You think about sort of, I mean, this is something that we can see something in the future. I mean, think of immuno-oncology, where the amount of data that's been generated is so vast that nobody can be up to date with all the studies, and sort of at some point in AI will have to give a recommendation which would be the best immuno-oncological treatment for a certain patient. And obviously, this should be ideally an unbiased algorithm and who takes the final decision.
Yes.
So this is really coming forward. Okay, very good. So let me just check with them. There's even one more question. So you mentioned the integration of European values into your presentation. Why the focus on European values? What if other cultures insist on different value systems? And how should companies respond to that?
This is no special bias from my side. This is only because I am a European, and actually the European legislation has been active in this field. But I know that also that the Chinese regulations have also taken these topics into their consideration. In the United States, we know that it depends on which state you are in. In California, there are a lot of activities in this area. So I'm not biased on the European. It's only because I am European. So I talk about things I know better.
Yeah. But we also, in the end, I mean, I can comment a little bit on this. We also see that sort of like when it comes to certain thinking in ethics around data and ethics around algorithms, that actually Europe is more advanced. And you can see this if you look into the sphere. So we're a little bit on the front runners, especially coming from the UK. So this might be something. But yeah, I mean, but how should companies respond to sort of like different value systems and how to react to them? This is a good question, I think, that companies deal with every day, and not something we can easily answer here.
Yeah.
So. Okay. So this has been a very good discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, Andre, and also really giving this the spin of showing the political impact that certain scandals might have and really what it triggers legislation-wise. So
thank you for hosting us, Johnny. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.